Have you ever wondered why the people who care the most seem to suffer the most? Why the most empathetic individuals often end up drained, used, and forgotten? Why your sensitivity to others' emotions has become your greatest source of pain? Jung discovered something disturbing about excessive empathy. It's not compassion. It's a psychological prison, and the bars are made from your own good intentions. The empathy trap. We live in a world that worships empathy. You've been conditioned to believe that feeling deeply makes you morally superior, that absorbing others' pain makes you a good person, that carrying the emotional weight of everyone around you is somehow noble. But Jung saw something darker in his clinical practice. He observed that his most empathetic patients weren't the healthiest, they were the most fragmented. They had become so attuned to others' emotional states that they'd completely lost touch with their own authentic feelings. Jung called this psychic contagion, the unconscious absorption of others' emotional contents to such a degree that you can no longer distinguish between what's yours and what belongs to someone else. And if you're highly empathetic, you're living this reality every day without even realizing it. Think about it. When was the last time you felt an emotion that was purely your own? When did you last experience anger, sadness, or joy that wasn't somehow connected to someone else's experience? When did you last make a decision based entirely on your own needs, rather than how it might affect others? The empathetic person lives in a constant state of emotional overwhelm because they're not just processing their own psychological material, they're processing everyone else's unconscious contents as well. You walk into a room and immediately absorb the anxiety of the stressed person in the corner, the anger of the frustrated colleague, the sadness of the heartbroken friend. And here's where it becomes a prison. You've been trained to see this as a gift. You've been told you're sensitive, intuitive, caring. But what you actually are is psychologically porous. You have no emotional boundaries. You're a sponge soaking up everyone else's unprocessed emotions, and it's slowly drowning you. The psychology of emotional absorption. Jung understood that healthy empathy involves what he called conscious participation, the ability to understand another's emotional state without being consumed by it. But pathological empathy is different. It's unconscious merging. When you experience pathological empathy, you don't just understand someone's pain, you become it. You don't just recognize someone's anxiety, you absorb it into your own nervous system. You don't just sympathize with someone's depression, you carry it around as if it were your own. This happens because empathetic individuals often have what Jung termed weak ego boundaries. Your sense of self is so permeable that you unconsciously take on the psychological contents of everyone around you. You become a repository for others' unprocessed emotions. But here's the manipulation that nobody talks about. Emotionally unhealthy people can sense this about you. They unconsciously recognize that you'll absorb their emotional garbage, and they use you as a psychological dumping ground. The narcissist vents their rage to you because they know you'll absorb it and carry it around, sparing them from having to process it themselves. The chronically anxious person unloads their fears onto you because they sense you'll take responsibility for their emotional regulation. The depressed person shares their hopelessness with you because they know you'll carry that weight. And you do it willingly because you've been conditioned to believe this makes you a good person. But what it actually makes you is a psychological slave. Jung observed that this dynamic creates what he called participation mystique, a primitive psychological state where boundaries between self and other dissolve completely. You stop being an individual and become a collection of everyone else's unprocessed emotional material. The illusion of virtue. The most insidious aspect of empathetic imprisonment is that it disguises itself as virtue. Society has taught you to see your excessive empathy as moral superiority. You're the good one, the caring one, the one who really understands. But Jung would challenge this narrative completely. He'd ask you, is your empathy really about compassion, or is it about control? Are you really helping others, or are you feeding your own psychological needs? Because here's what excessive empathy often masks: a deep fear of rejection, an inability to tolerate others' negative emotions, and an unconscious need to be needed. You don't absorb others' pain because you're so virtuous. You do it because you can't bear the anxiety of not being able to fix everything. The truly empathetic person, Jung would argue, is the one who can witness suffering without absorbing it. They can offer support without taking responsibility for others' emotional regulation. They can care deeply while maintaining clear psychological boundaries. But the pathologically empathetic person needs others to be emotionally dependent on them. They need to be the helper, the fixer, the one who understands. Because if they're not absorbing someone else's emotions, they have to face their own, and that terrifies them. This is why your empathy has become a prison. It's not serving others, it's serving your own unconscious needs while slowly destroying your psychological integrity. The psychological cost. Jung documented the devastating effects of pathological empathy on individual psychological development. When you constantly absorb others' emotional contents, several things happen to your psyche. First, you lose contact with your own authentic emotions. You become so skilled at feeling what others feel that you forget how to feel what you feel. Your emotional responses become reactions to others' states rather than authentic expressions of your inner world. Second, you develop what Jung called false persona, a personality constructed entirely around being the helper, the empath, the understanding one. But this persona isn't you. It's a psychological defense against having to discover who you actually are beneath all that absorbed emotional material. Third, you become addicted to crisis. Because your identity depends on being needed emotionally, you unconsciously seek out or create situations where others require your empathetic intervention. You surround yourself with broken people not because you want to help them, but because they validate your sense of purpose. Fourth, you develop what Jung termed psychological inflation around your empathy. You begin to believe you're more emotionally intelligent, more caring, more evolved than others. This superiority complex masks the reality that you're actually psychologically underdeveloped, unable to maintain basic emotional boundaries. Finally, you attract parasitic relationships. People who are emotionally immature, narcissistic, or manipulative gravitate toward you because they sense you'll do their emotional work for them. You become a magnet for exactly the kind of people who will exploit your empathetic nature. The manipulation mechanism. Here's what Jung understood that most people miss. Excessive empathy doesn't just make you vulnerable to manipulation, it makes you a willing participant in your own psychological exploitation. The manipulator doesn't need to force you to absorb their emotions. You do it automatically. They don't need to ask you to fix their problems. You volunteer. They don't need to make you responsible for their feelings. You take that responsibility upon yourself. This creates the perfect parasitic dynamic. They get to remain emotionally immature while you do all the psychological heavy lifting. They get to avoid processing their own difficult emotions while you carry that burden. They get to stay broken while you exhaust yourself trying to fix them. And the most devastating part, you'll defend this dynamic. You'll convince yourself that you're helping, that you're needed, that this is what love looks like. You'll make excuses for their emotional immaturity while sacrificing your own psychological well-being. Jung called this unconscious participation in others' pathology. You become so invested in being the helper that you actually enable others' dysfunction. Your empathy stops being compassionate and starts being codependent. The manipulator thrives in this arrangement because they never have to develop emotional self-regulation. Why should they learn to process their own difficult emotions when you'll do it for them? Why should they develop resilience when you'll absorb all their stress? Why should they take responsibility for their feelings when you've already taken that responsibility from them? The path to psychological freedom. Jung's solution to pathological empathy wasn't to become callous or uncaring. It was to develop what he called conscious compassion, the ability to care without merging, to help without absorbing, to support without sacrificing your psychological integrity. This requires developing several key capacities. First, emotional differentiation. Learning to distinguish between your authentic emotions and the emotions you've absorbed from others. This means spending time in solitude regularly, allowing absorbed emotional material to settle so you can reconnect with your own emotional truth. Second, boundary consciousness. Understanding that healthy relationships require psychological boundaries, not psychological merging. You can care about someone's pain without making it your pain. You can support someone's healing without taking responsibility for their emotional regulation. Third, selective empathy. Recognizing that you don't owe empathy to everyone equally. Some people have earned the right to your emotional investment through reciprocity and respect. Others are trying to use your empathy to avoid their own psychological development. Fourth, shadow integration. Acknowledging that your excessive empathy often masks less virtuous motivations, the need to control, the fear of abandonment, the addiction to being needed. Only by integrating these shadow aspects can you develop authentic compassion. Fifth, conscious participation. Learning to choose when to engage empathetically rather than doing it automatically. Empathy becomes a conscious tool you use strategically rather than an unconscious pattern that controls you. The transformation. When you learn to break free from pathological empathy, something profound shifts in your relationships and your sense of self. You discover that you can care deeply without carrying everyone's emotional baggage. You can be supportive without being depleted. You can love without losing yourself. The people who were using your empathy for emotional regulation will either learn to regulate themselves, or they'll move on to find another emotional host. This might feel like loss initially, but Jung would tell you it's actually liberation. You're finally free to form relationships based on mutual respect rather than parasitic need. Your authentic emotions begin to emerge from beneath all that absorbed material. You start to discover preferences, desires, and reactions that are genuinely yours rather than reflexive responses to others' needs. You develop what Jung called individual personality, a sense of self that exists independently of your empathetic function. Most importantly, you discover that conscious compassion is actually more helpful than unconscious absorption. When you can witness suffering without being consumed by it, you can offer clearer guidance, more stable support, and genuine healing presence. You become truly useful to others instead of just emotionally available. The empathy paradox. Here's Jung's final insight about empathy. The people who are most empathetic in healthy ways are often those who've learned to be selfish in protective ways. They've developed the ability to guard their emotional energy, to choose their empathetic investments wisely, and to maintain their psychological integrity even while caring deeply. Your empathy was never meant to be a prison. It was meant to be a bridge, a way of connecting with others while remaining rooted in your own authentic experience. But when empathy becomes unconscious absorption, when caring becomes psychological merging, when compassion becomes codependence, it stops serving love and starts serving fear. The most compassionate thing you can do is learn to be empathetic without being consumable, to care without being used, to help without being depleted. Because in the end, the world doesn't need more people who absorb everyone else's pain. It needs more people who can witness pain clearly, respond wisely, and maintain the emotional strength necessary to offer genuine healing. Your empathy is not your weakness, but your inability to regulate it consciously has become your prison. The key to freedom lies not in caring less, but in caring more skillfully. The question isn't whether you should stop being empathetic. The question is, are you ready to transform your empathy from an unconscious wound into a conscious gift? Remember, the truly empathetic person doesn't carry everyone else's emotional baggage. They help others learn to carry their own.